Hi, Doug. How are you?
Hi, Aubrey. So good to see you. And so excited to have more conversations about China and the world, and today about China and Japan.
Yep.
So good to talk to you.
Yeah, nice to talk to you too. And there's always something interesting to talk about. It seems that the world is always changing, shifting. It's a very dynamic time to be having conversations about China and especially right now, China and Japan. So before we get into that though, I was curious about the different methods that On Global Leadership uses in its research and studies. I know that we talk a lot about sort of the ethnographic, boots on the ground research component of how OGL does its work. The most recent article that we are publishing about the Japan and China issue, it's a little bit different. So, do you want to talk a little about the methods of this article?
Sure. Thank you for that. And to your point, Aubrey, just to remind our audience, when we talk about boots on the ground, we all like to think about economic data and statistics, and we're all trained, with statistical analysis and how to read data and how to analyze data. But we also fundamentally believe in the mixture of advanced statistical analysis with a boots on the ground approach to really understanding what's happening in China. So we like to mix economics and anthropology, if you will, like thinking about ethnographic work and talking to people informs what kinds of questions you ask with economic data. And it informs how you interpret the economic data, and it informs what you really understand that Chinese factories are doing or Chinese officials are thinking with data. And so that's one piece of it. There's a second piece that really comes from my own background as well, which is deeply tied to history. I just think you can't really understand what different countries are going through. And this is true for any country, not just China, but unless you really have some historical context. And I think that one of the things that has been problematic about the field of economics is that you get a lot of people who just, again, love to look at data and they're not out on the ground talking to people, but they're also not deeply embedded in the historical context. And in this particular case that we're going to discuss right now, the historical context is really, really important. And so, this article that we're publishing right now is more deeply embedded in the historical context than it is in the sort of ethnographic context, although still our colleagues, our boots on the ground people, the OGL team in China, Chris and Deshelle, um, you know, they do get out into the field and get into social media and sort of think about like, how are Chinese people thinking about this issue and how do we understand this? But I just also want to emphasize to our audience, we care about history. History matters. And in this case, history really matters. And so we'll talk about that more as we get into our conversation, I'm sure. But thank you for asking the methods question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess let's talk about what happened in November and what China's response was. So it seems that the Prime Minister of Japan was asked a question about a hypothetical scenario about use of force, and the response she gave was a scenario involving Taiwan. Um, why was that a challenging statement to make? And let's talk a little bit about China's response to that.
Sure. I mean, wonderful framing of the question because, you know, again, this was like a moment in parliament and she's talking about, uses of force and she brings up an example. And this example just historically is sort of a hot button issue, not just for China, but for China and the world, but also China and Japan specifically. And so I want to talk a little bit about history right here, but just to answer the question more superficially first, this is a moment in which China is thinking very carefully about China Taiwan relations and the ways in which managing Taiwan relations needs to continue, and it needs to continue in a peaceful way. Um, and then we have the Prime Minister of Japan, Takaichi, saying in a hypothetical situation of, bringing up the Taiwan issue and talking about, the use of force across the Taiwan Strait and this would be an existential crisis for Japan. Wow. Okay, so that's a lot. But let me just, you very artfully asked the methodological question at the beginning. And so let me take a step back here. Again, OGL likes to think about methods in two ways. We love statistics and we love data and we love economic data, but we also like to do ethnographic work and talk to people about how they're feeling about things and let that inform our statistical analyses. But we're also deep historians. Okay. And so, like, if you remember my career as I grew up, I was a Chinese language, literature, and history major at the University of Chicago with a minor in economics, but I became obsessed with the history. And the history is really, really important on this particular topic. And this history, I think a lot of people don't know, Aubrey. Um, China was the most powerful nation in the world for thousands of years, right? And I always like to cite, um, the Ming Dynasty and the death of Emperor Yongle in 1424, and like this sort of basic idea that at that time, China had been, sort of the most powerful, innovator and a powerful economy and powerful armada for thousands of years. And then when Emperor Yongle died, we started to see sort of the building of the Ming Wall, and eventually it became the Qing Dynasty Wall, and sort of China focusing inward and enclosing. And during that time, the West was using a lot of China's innovations, like the printing press and like gunpowder, to go out and conquer the world. And so, like, this is the sort of, in some ways, the mindset of China. Now, the reason that historical context is so important is because the 19th century was a really, really, really difficult time for China. And so, if you think about some things that happened during that period, we have the Opium Wars. Most people don't know the reason that Hong Kong became a British colony was because of drug sales, right? Like, China said, we don't want your opium anymore. We're not going to allow it to come in. And then the Dutch East India Trading Company and Britain and a couple of other players said, yeah, we're going to continue selling drugs in your country, and we're going to go to war over it. And so you have two opium wars, from 1839 and then in 1842, in which basically the West was going to war with China over the right to sell drugs. And then when those wars were over, they took over the little jewel called Hong Kong, right? So I always like to give this example to my students. Like, imagine if, there was a war with Mexico over the right to sell fentanyl in the United States, and like the United States lost the war, and then they said, oh, and by the way, we're taking over Los Angeles. Like, that's the history, right? I mean, that, and that might sound like a crazy history and or a crazy idea, but like, that's what happened. There was opium wars. There was wars over the rights to sell drugs in China. China lost the war, and Hong Kong was taken. Okay. And so, like, that history matters, right? And then there was something called the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, in which Japan was sort of a rising power, and it was a rising power both economically but also militarily, and China was in a very weakened position. And after the Sino-Japanese War, which was incredibly embarrassing for the Qing dynasty and for China's, just governing powers, Japan took Taiwan. Right. And so, like, if, I lived in Taiwan for a year in 1989, 90. And, there are lots of people whose parents speak Japanese because they were taught Japanese in Chinese schools. And so, like, the idea, so there's pain in this period. And then after the Sino-Japanese War and the warlord period during the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, and then the warlord period, it was just a painful period. And eventually you had more and more aggression from Japan towards China that led up to World War II. And then eventually you had the defeat of Japan in World War II. And, the tragic circumstances of that with the use of nuclear weapons and et cetera. But, like, it's a very painful period, right? And then with Taiwan, the one other additional issue that you have is during the communist revolution, the communists won that war, the nationalists lost. Now, when the nationalists lost, they went to the little island of Taiwan, and they kind of continued to claim to the world that they were the legitimate governors of China, even though they had lost the communist revolution, and Taiwan is an island of 19 million people. And, there's a country of 1.4 billion people that they were not governing, but they claimed to be the governors. And the world sort of recognized that, right? So until 1972, Taiwan occupied not just Taiwan, but like the nationalists under, the nationalists who had lost the war to the communists, they occupied China's seat on the Security Council until 1972. And so, this is just I raise all of this, Aubrey, because it's an important history, and it's an important history between China and Taiwan, between, and Taiwan is a part of China, right? Like, we've all agreed to that in the world. Taiwan is a province of China, and it is a part of China, but like the tensions over those relationships have been really complex historically, and Japan has been a part of that, right?
Hmm.
So sorry for the long historical discussion, but I think the history matters here, because when the prime minister of Japan says something about China and Taiwan, like, that history is in people's minds. Like, even if most people in the West don't know that history, people in China do. And so when she
Right.
says things like, okay, well, the, you know, ocean, military vessels like across the Taiwan Strait, like if China invaded, she's just doing a hypothetical in a state meeting. But these things are not just hypotheticals. They have like a lot of deep history. And so it really matters to think about the history. So sorry for the long-winded historical answer, but I think it's important to put this in historical context.
Right. I think it is important because the conversation isn't just about, Japan and a hypothetical situation, self-defense, or even offensive measures. But she stepped across what we call the reddest red line in the article. And that is in an unscripted moment where she's answering this hypothetical question, but she made a choice, deliberate or not in the moment, to say something incendiary to an important trading partner. And it does seem that I think we call it the century of humiliation in the article. Then bringing this up, she's new, hasn't had maybe the length of time to build those diplomatic relationships. This is very challenging to overcome. So, what are the implications of this comment between the relationship between China and Japan? And I guess I'm curious about, obviously there's economic fallout from this, or there could be some pretty big economic fallout. There's definitely some supply chain impact. And then I'm curious also, because we've got the boots on the ground, I guess that's a two-part question. What's the economic impact of it? And then what are people saying? How are people feeling about this, both in China and Japan?
Right. So great question. And before I dive into your two-part question, look at you. You've been reading the work, and yes. So when I was giving my historical background, I didn't mention it, but you did. The That period of the Opium Wars to the end of the Communist Revolution was what was called in China the century of humiliation. I mean, it was a very, very dark, difficult time, and Japan was a part of that. So the first Opium War was launched, I think, in 1839. And then you have the Second Opium War, and then you have the Sino-Japanese War, and then you have the fall of the Qing Dynasty, and then you have the Warlord period. And then, eventually the Communist Revolution, which was completed in 1949. So, like, this was the century of humiliation, 110 years. Um, and, that's relevant for how Chinese people think about this period. And Japan was a significant player, right? The Sino-Japanese War was a significant thing in this, and then, the aggression in China during the lead up to World War II, and, my own school, Thunderbird School of Global Management, and the Flying Tigers, kind of helping defend China against Japan. Like, there's a lot of history here, right? Okay. Now, so to get to your question, there are two issues that I would emphasize here that really have to do with what OGL likes to emphasize about our analyses. One is, and people get nervous and upset when I say in the United States that we're married to China but my meaning of that is that we are so deeply embedded economically that you can't get away from it. It's fundamental. And that's true for the United States, but it's also true for Japan, right? I mean, China is the largest market in the world. I mean, maybe India is as big, but India is not spending as much money consumerly as China is. But China is a large market, and it is the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so, to the extent that companies like Apple, Tesla, and Walmart are deeply embedded in China, so are many Japanese companies, right? And so, the economic interdependence is not just about consumer markets and who's selling to whom, but it's about like where your manufacturing supply chains are and what you need in the world. And in our last episode, we talked about rare earths, and we talked about the issue of like, how dependent the United States for building things like iPhones and anything in the high tech industry is dependent on China, because China basically controls the distillation of about 70% of the rare earths in the world. And you need rare earths to make things like iPhones. And so this is a really powerful position. And so we need to be careful. Like, we need to be careful, not just to be good moral citizens, but we also need to be careful economically. Like, if China wants to like send a shot across the bow, they can control the release of rare earths to places like China and Japan. In Japan, very recently, the shot across the bow has been a little different, because of the prime minister's statement, China has unleashed the idea that like, okay, so anybody who's involved in what we call dual industry production. And so like, if you think about Mitsubishi, like corporation, like this is an organization that you think of as tied to like the industrial production of things that have to do with automobiles. But there's a lot of organizations in a number of industries that are industrial production industries that have dual production, which is one is for what their product is, but the other is for the military industrial complex. And, China has basically said, okay, any company that has dual production that is related to the military industrial complex, we're going to give you guys problems. There's going to be a difficult time for you. And there was initially 5 companies that were sort of labeled in this process, but there's a whole list of them, of organizations that are going to be hurt in this process. And so the idea is like, Prime Minister, if you want to flex your muscles and make internal threats that are maybe hidden threats, they're not real threats, but they're like threats that are about one key issue, which is the fact that we believe and we know that Taiwan is a part of China. And it's a historically messy process, but there's no negotiating on this point. We might cut off all of your organizations that are tied to the dual production purpose, anybody who's tied to the military industrial complex. And so again, you get like this, things get messy pretty quickly. And here again, Aubrey, this is tied to history, right? Like, in addition to that history about the century of humiliation, the United States, after Nixon like visited China and we sort of got to the point where Taiwan was not the representative on the United Nations state body, but China became the representative. And then in 1979, we agreed to the idea of the one China policy. We call it also the one China principle, because people in the United States and all over the world get weird with what policies are. But the one China principle is that Taiwan is a part of China. Taiwan is a Chinese province. It's an island that, has a very complicated history because of Japan and because of the KMT, but it is a part of China. And so the one China principle is what allowed us to go forward in building an economic relationship with China. And, everybody has signed off on that. So So here again, when the prime minister of Japan talks about, the idea of military resistance to enforcing the one China principle, things get messy. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it does. Yeah, and somewhere in my brain, I recall that China used to be called a sleeping dragon. And so I was thinking about that and I was like, well, this doesn't seem like a very sleepy dragon anymore. This seems like a very different way of perceiving China. And, I know that you have said, and you mentioned it just now, that, the US and China are married, and we are the top two economies in the United States. And so I wonder, I'm sitting in my home in Michigan in the United States, and I wonder, well, what does it mean for me? This is all happening so far away. W- What does that mean for me as a United States citizen, somebody sitting, across oceans? So, what are we hearing from folks in the U.S. about the impact, or are we kind of just oblivious and living our lives?
Well, I love the way you framed the question, and so let me take both the historical, but also the very much what does this mean for American citizens part of this. So again, the historical part, and forgive us for talking so much about history in this podcast, but it's important. Knowing history matters, and so the century of humiliation and the fall of the Qing dynasty and the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War, like these all matter, and they're all historical context for everybody. And, also the more recent history matters, right? Like, we've talked about this in our podcasts, and I always talk about this when I teach my classes on China and bring out my guitar and play Take Me Home Country Roads, because like there was a moment when Deng Xiaoping came to the United States after Mao Zedong died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978. And then he came to the United States in 1979 to shake hands with Jimmy Carter and agree to the one China principle. And then, the markets were opened up, right? And at that time, China had been suffering for many years. And so it wasn't a powerful economy. But over the last 45 years, they've built the most powerful manufacturing economy and the second largest economy in the world. And they've become very, 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 very powerful. And we're very dependent on them, right? And so, like you and I have talked about this before, but like companies like Apple, who I worked for several years, you know, the reason Apple is the most profitable company in the world is because it works with 1,600 manufacturers in China. And so it's like able to sort of move this manufacturing supply chain around and really kind of be strategic in how they deal with people. But it's powerful. And as we just mentioned in our discussion, we're heavily dependent on China for things like rare earths, right? And so like you can't get away from this. Like we cannot walk away in that circumstance. So when I talk about us being married to China, like it's not just, just random statements and random like use of words. Like we're deeply embedded. Like we are deeply, deeply, deeply tied to this country and this economy. And so if we're going to do things well, and if you and I are going to be able to buy iPhones, we need China, right? Like China cannot just go produce iPhones in Chennai, India, because Chennai is where Foxconn is. And so we think, oh, so they're building up iPhones in Chennai, but that's just final assembly. There are hundreds of components and modules that are built in China, and India doesn't have that supply chain, right? So either we're going to rebuild that supply chain in India or rebuild it in America, but it's going to make iPhones much, 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 much more expensive, right? So like we're dependent on these issues, right? And so like, and same with Japan, right? Japan is deeply dependent on China also, right? And so China holds a lot of cards here. So that's just the economics of this. But to get to your second part of your question, you know, as Chinese people sort of experience these conversations, and just bearing in mind that China is, they control media and they control, how people perceive things. Um, what people's perceptions of Americans and of Japanese companies and organizations are, it matters, right? And so, like, you and I talk about this. We've talked about this in a couple of different sessions in the past couple of weeks. I think partnership matters. Like, I think we need to be very, very, it doesn't mean we have to agree with what everybody does, but it does mean we need to be thoughtful and deep in terms of thinking about our approach to partnership and how we're sort of framing the relationships that we're having with different countries around the world. Right. And
Hmm.
so, just the same way that the United States and China relationships matter, so do Japan and Japanese and Chinese relationships matter. And so we just need to really, really think deeply about the history and politics of this and like map that onto our economic analyses and our economic proposals. Does that make sense?
It does. And I know that, US China relations are very important, like you said, US Japan relationships are very important. And then what happens, when two of our very important trading partners aren't getting along? Um, while we were warming up for our conversation here, we were talking about figure 5 in the article that OGL is publishing. And it has this graphic of uh, both Chinese and Japanese citizens who have a good impression of the other country and a bad impression of the other country. And this was a 2024 joint survey by the Genron NPO and China International Publishing Group. And it looks like there was 2,500 responses. And it's really interesting to see it, but that, Japanese citizens with a bad impression of China is pretty high as of 2023. I think it's, oh gosh, it looks roughly 90%. And the same with, Chinese with a bad impression of Japan is looks about 90% in 2023. So there's I think, somebody from my perspective, like, I have a pretty good impression of both countries, but I don't have the deep wounds and kind of the
Right.
history to associate with it. But it doesn't feel like they're poised for pressure from their citizens to perhaps, make up and get along. They each might see this as, well, of course we're fighting because, how we view the other side. I'm not sure how that plays out on the ground, but
Right.
just curious, how important is this public perception to what the leadership might be thinking, doing, and acting upon?
So I love the question, Aubrey, because it like allows me to pitch for OGL a little bit. And what we try to do is we try to educate people on, how complex these issues are. And so, um, uh, I love your citation of the graphic in our forthcoming article. It is startling. If you go back to 2005, which is when that graphic starts, it's still a little bit of a distance, but like it's close. It's closer, right? Like, you know, Chinese views of Japan, Japanese views of China, like, positive, negative, like it's closer. And then over the course of the last 20 years, we just see this major divergence in which, like, in both countries, 90% of the citizens think in bad ways about Japan and China in each case. And, like, a very small percentage think positively. Okay, so that's significant, right? Like, we have a real tension that's emerging here, and again, that's against the backdrop of the history of the countries and the rise of China as the most powerful, second most powerful, but in our view, soon to be most powerful economy in the world, and Japan's role in the world, and all of this stuff matters, right? But the reason that these kinds of statistics of public perception matter so much is that they have implications for the politics, right? They have implications for like what's going to happen. And so the prime minister feels confident saying things about Taiwan and China. And, here again, like the OGL position is very clear. Like, we believe in the one China policy. And like we've talked a lot about that historically, but uh, the idea that the prime minister is talking about this in a meeting has implications for the ways in which the two countries and their populations think about things. The second thing that's so important for OGL, though, is that is to go back to our framing of this, is that the global political economy is so intricately interconnected, right? The United States, we're married to China. I know that people in the US don't like it when I say that, but we are. We are so dependent. Japan is too, right? And this is not just for rare earths or Apple's manufacturing supply chain in China, but it's also for, you know, companies that are doing major industrial business in China and might also have a secondary business that's a part of the military industrial complex, right? And so, like, just understanding the intricacies that are hidden behind the scenes about how much our economies are all interconnected is really important. And so then when you sort of, whether you're the prime minister of Japan or, you know, the president of China or the president of the United States, and you're sort of mapping on people's opinions about Japan as a country, China as a country, the United States as a country, I don't think that's a good way to make policy. Like I just think it's a little bit dangerous. And I think all good politicians will sort of navigate and mitigate those perceptions a little bit. And it just seems like what the prime minister of Japan did was very incendiary because she sort of like mapped onto this, like, well, my population has this very negative view of China and Chinese population has a very negative view of us. And we can talk about these things. I just think it's dangerous. I think it's not smart.
Hmm.
So, I don't have the prime minister's number, but if she wanted, views from me, I would tell her, please don't say things like that.
Right. I think it demonstrates perhaps her comments made sense where she was speaking and who she was speaking directly to. There are ears elsewhere that hear these things, and I'm just looking in our article. It says after Takaichi's November 7th remarks, Beijing launched coordinated multi-track countermeasures spanning diplomacy, the military, culture, tourism, education, and the economy, demanding that she retract her offending words. And she hasn't to date, as the time we're having this conversation. I mean, those are deep and serious cuts, that China is making. And so I guess we'll just stay close to this topic and see what happens. But as you've mentioned, everything is very intricately connected and there will be impact on us. What that is, it's hard to say at the moment, but from my perspective, this will impact just as the Venezuela situation between the US and Venezuela, that will be remains to be seen what the full impact of that is with global relationships. But this is an important time, and I think it's great that OGL is staying close to it and thinking deeply about it, and that we have our partners in on the ground in China who can help us understand what this means from the Chinese perspective.
Yeah.
Anything else on this topic, Doug?
Well, I mean, I think you summarized it beautifully, so I won't go too much deeper than, again, but thinking about, these multi-method approaches and thinking about ethnography and statistics is great, but thinking about historical context and all of the things that matter here is really important also. But then mapping all of those things onto the geopolitical relations, right? So we have economics over here, and we're talking about like how important our economic relationships are, but we also have these historical relations and geopolitical dynamics that are crucial. Like we can't get away from it. And if we want to have a safe, productive world, we all need to work together as partners, right? And so like if, any of these politicians were willing to listen to me, I would be saying like, you know, be in contact, like be talking to each other about like what our economic and political and geopolitical ties are. And yeah, there are long, complicated historical relationships here, which include the island of Taiwan, which is a province of China. and it's a complicated situation. And so we just need to think about all of these issues in very complex ways. And so I love to think about, research about, and write about those issues. And I love talking with you about these issues. And so thank you for the great conversation and great questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Doug. So I think today's conversation was a really important one, and I was curious mostly from my perspective about the citizens' view, which I know is important to every country's economy, is how are the citizens thinking, feeling, acting. But what does this mean for um, you know, companies and people doing business with China, in China, and with Japan and in Japan? Let's talk about the perspective of the commercial perspective.
So it's a great question, Aubrey, and that's a really nice way to sort of frame out and conclude our conversation. And we always at OGL want to be sort of analysts, but also diplomats and helping organizations think about doing business in China. If you'll remember my experience of working for Apple, these are some of the smartest business people I've ever known, but like it was really important to help them understand the politics of doing business in China and the history of doing business in China. And so the same kind of question comes to this. One of the things from a very strategic perspective that I would take, if I was advising Japanese companies, like, you know, the companies that are part of the targeted group that China has put under fire for, the dual production that has to do with both with the industry, but also with the military industrial complex. You know, they need to be lobbying their government to be very, very effective in the idea that we are married to China and we are deeply embedded here and we need China, right? And so, like, if China decided to just cut off Japanese companies from, industrial production in China, it would be a disaster for the Japanese economy. It would be a disaster, just the same way it would be for American companies. And so, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants economic disasters because China would be hurt too. But China holds a lot of the cards here. And so if I was advising those companies, I would be saying, like, hey, why don't you go talk to your prime minister and tell her to tone it down? And maybe she should even apologize and say, I didn't mean that, right? Like, that's the kind of lobbying that I think is really effective in this moment. From the US perspective, it's an interesting moment here as well. And I don't want to frame this as being too opportunistic, but these are moments in which we can continue to frame the approach and the topic of, like, we're deeply embedded in China. We are deeply tied here, and we're partners, right? I like the word partnership, and we've talked about this before. I'll mention the word again, 合作伙伴, which means partnership and cooperation. And when you think about issues that happen and moments that come up in global geopolitical issues, the U.S. economy relations, U.S.-China relations, we are also in the wake of the Venezuelan situation. This is a really important time for our companies to be advocating for deep, deep connection and deep, deep cooperation. And so if I was, advising a few companies, and I'm advising a few, but like if I was advising some of the larger organizations, I would be making the case that they should be talking to people in Washington and getting everybody to calm things down and getting everybody to think about U.S.-China relations and cooperation and collaboration. Doesn't mean we need to roll over and do everything that China wants us to do, but it does mean we all need to recognize how deep these ties are and how important they are and how we can mutually influence each other for both societies to be in a better place. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Hmm. Thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you, Aubrey. I love these conversations with you, and we're just going to keep having them. So thank you for being the host of Boots on the Ground OGL.
Yeah, happy to help. It's always a pleasure to learn from you, Doug, and the rest of the team. My mind is expanded all the time, so I appreciate it. And for those listening, the article will be published at ongloballeadership.com, and we will be back next week with more
More
with on
exciting
the ground.
conversation.
Exactly, exactly.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Aubrey.